Good morning, dearest friends. Welcome. It is Thursday already. Yeah, well, we had a short week. We're still in the aftermath of Shavuos. I guess maybe aftermath is a negative. We are still in the Yemei Tashlumin, in the days where in temple times, folks that went up to Yerushalayim for Yontif to be Ola Regel would bring the karbanot that they couldn't bring on Yontif. They'd bring it until the 12th of Sivan. Today is the 10th of Sivan, the 9th of June. Again, it's Thursday, and we're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Today, I want to mention today's yard site, a friend from Shova, Eli Bareket's mother, Rachel Bas Yitzchak. So we'll honor her neshama with this learning, as well as dedicate it to the wonderful members of our Chabura and their households. They're dedicating time out of a busy schedule, and truly a wonderful tribute, especially as we're in the days of that follow Shavuos. It should bring and hopefully be a big bracha for everyone in their lives. Today's Gemara will take on a familiar Talmudic style discussion. We are still talking about the laws of fire, with a slight pivot for the moment to discussion about a candle. A candle is a fire adjacent topic because, well, it goes without saying. And unfortunately, many a fire probably is the result of a fire. That's not directly our discussion, but the discussion is about extinguishing, moving, putting out fire. Because, and I guess I should back up once more and say that the Mishnah that we just studied yesterday does talk about fire extinguishing, fire salvaging, fire rescuing efforts. The few proposals, Rabbi Shimon ben Anas talks about putting a fireproof, a fire retardant material over the portion of a chest that's not on fire. We talked about creating a barrier made out of kalim to block the fire, and we spoke about a machlokes or possible machlokes about putting vessels that will definitely explode and thus expose water to the fire. That was the Mishnah's discussion. And our Gemara went on to talk about when and how and why one can do fire extinguishing efforts. I showed you in the Rambam yesterday, it's clear that we're not, at least from most of the commentaries, that we're not talking about putting out a fire, but protecting that which is not yet on fire. And we dropped the words, or we drew a distinction between garam, kiboy, causing, doing something that will cause extinguishing versus directly extinguishing fire. Rabbi Yossi seems to feel that garam, kiboy is prohibited. Rabbi Shimon would seem to say that it is permissible. That was yesterday's discussion. At the very end, we pivoted to a discussion about a lamp or a candle placed on a board. Can you move the board? If you need the board, can you remove the candle? That's going to be today's discussion. I was just thinking today you might have a different proposal than putting an earthenware vessel. You might want to put a series of water balloons on the periphery of the fire. And as soon as the fire spreads a little further, melt the balloon and introduce the water. And possibly Rabbi Shimon would say that's okay. And Rabbi Yossi would certainly not believe that is okay. Now let's go into our Gemara again about a candle on a board. And this Gemara is interesting because it's the intersection of a few different potential issues. There's the issue of extinguishing fire, big one, but there's also the issue of muksa. And muksa actually appears to be the primary conversation that we're having here. So again, just to remind you that sometimes on Shabbos, there are multiple concerns. So there's the possibility of putting out a fire. That's not to be done on Shabbos. And then there's something called muksa, that you're not allowed to handle something which is off limits, cannot be used on Shabbos for a variety of reasons. And today's Gemara will ultimately be more about muksa than fire. Let's jump back in. We read these lines yesterday, but let's go at it again. Tana Rabbanan. Our sages taught, Ner shal gabe tavla. You have a ner. Rashi says it's a lamp. Tosfos strongly indicated, if you recall, that we're not talking about a lamp with oil, but a candle sounds more right. You're allowed to shake the board to remove the muktzah item and it'll fall. Your intention is not to certainly extinguish the fire, but there's a good chance it's going to go out. The im kavsa, kavsa. And if the lamp or the fire happens to be extinguished, okay. Because that's not your intention and that's not what you are directly doing. Amri devei Rav Yanai. This is not always the case. This is only because he forgot and left the candle there, but not that he placed it intentionally. Were the item to be placed down intentionally on the tablet, on the board, nasa basis l'davar asar. Well, now the board becomes a support for something that is muktzah because it cannot be handled on Shabbos, and the board too is muktzah. Let's read Rashi. He unintentionally forgot the lamp or the candle, depending on how you decipher it, but it was not with kavana, it was not with intention. If he placed it intentionally, the board becomes the base, the support of something which is asur. And then you cannot move it, handle it, or touch it in order to remove the candle because the board becomes muktzah. This is the initial teaching here on the subject of a candle or a lamp on a board. Tana. Similar but different. Ner shachari adela. So here we're talking about handling, moving. We talked about that we're not afraid if you inadvertently possibly trigger a fire to be extinguished. Toysus pointed out to us, just want to remind you that the Yerushalmi has this teaching, but they deleted 2 words. They deleted the words v'im kavsa kavsa. Okay, 3 words. So the Yerushalmi seems to be studying this entirely as a discussion about the muktzah, whereas the way we have this tradition, it's also about a fire potentially going out.
So this is actually the source of drama and ether of drama and Shabbos.
Yeah. So that's and doctor, that's the connection to our previous Gemara. Our previous Gemara is talking about Gorem being a trigger for Kiboy by placing a fire retardant item over here, or by placing water on the periphery of a garment here, or by opening a garment. One may lead the fire to be put out, but those are not certainly fire extinguishing efforts, which reminds me, I should reiterate. We mentioned a brisa that says that you can unfold a garment or unroll a Torah scroll, and if the fire goes out, it goes out. We're not talking about that you wave it in the air or blow wind in it or whatever, which would definitely put it out. We're just talking about opening it in a conventional manner, which maybe it'll go out, maybe it won't. So yes, we're talking about Gurama, about indirectly causing different Shabbos-related problems.
Rabbi, if the fire falls off a table, or if the lamp falls off a table, the candle with the lit candle, and it falls onto some paper, and the paper starts to burn, can we stamp it out immediately?
From what our Gemara has told us thus far, no. From what our Gemara said thus far, no. I'm adding that big caveat because you may recall when we studied the Shulchan Aruch, it said Bizman Hazeh. Nowadays, there are a number of factors that might change things, but for now, let's keep it from what the Gemara has told us. No.
Rabbi,
There's an issue of pikuach nefesh that would be different. If there's but we're gonna. I'll tell you why I don't want to answer, because the Gemara is going to give us some interesting solutions based on what we've already said. Maybe you can create a border of water around it so that it doesn't spread. And remember, in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, on one hand, things were extremely flammable. On the other hand, the floor was earth. And so if something fell on the ground on fire, it most likely or very possibly would not spread. Red Barrel, yes.
are we dealing with the principle here of the difference of preventing something from getting burnt and putting out a fire? Because if we are, the question to me would be something that could be both. Like a sprinkler system does not necessarily put out a fire. In many places, it's there to wet the stuff, to retard the fire until whatever.
Is that, you see, I didn't realize that. That's interesting. So are you saying that the principle of sprinklers is not just to put out the fire directly, but also to
Right.
to dampen an area to the point where the fire will not find friendly?
Absolutely.
Interesting. I guess I hadn't given it much thought. Very interesting. Well, there you go. But and then there's also a question of if you are, I'm not going to give you the answer now because it's not so straightforward, but if you could flip a switch that was not electric and trigger a sprinkling system to go on that might put out the fire, that would be an interesting question. Could you do that?
It's not electric. You just turn the knob. You can put them on.
Okay, so that's an interesting
Plumbing.
question.
It's plumbing.
Is that grama, or is that direct?
Right.
Let's see if we get any clues going forward. That's an interesting question. All right, let's continue the Gemara a little bit. Here we go. A similar but different question. Tona, ner shachore hadelas. You have a candle that is behind the door, or I think the word is not really behind the door. Well, it is behind the door, but it's in the, when the door is open, it's in the pathway of wind. One is permitted to open and close the door in a normal manner. Ve'im kavsa, and if the fire happens to be extinguished, what could we do? That's life. I don't believe we're talking about the wind of the movement of the door, although maybe we are. So I guess either we're talking about the wind the door itself makes or the wind that is allowed inside. This is the teaching. Layet Allah Rav. Rav literally cursed. A better word is condemned those who followed this halacha. Why? Well, Rashi says, Al kol hamoyrim kain. Rav condemned anybody who actually paskined that you're allowed to open a door and close the door, notwithstanding the possibility that that movement would put the fire out. Ravina says to Rav Acha, son of Rava, alternatively, Rav Acha asked the question to Rav Ashi. What's the question? My taima layet ala Rav. What did Rav have wrong? What did Rav have against this practice? Why did Rav have a problem with allowing a door to be opened? Ilema mishum de Rav savalak Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe you'll try to tell me that Rav paskins like Rabbi Yehuda, who says, even Rashi says, davar she'ein miskaven aser. You're not allowed to lead to a melacha, even though that's not your kavana. It's only your kavana to open the door. You need to get inside the house. You're not miskaven to put out the fire. That was not at all your desire, your intention. Well, that can't be. Maybe because Rav holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who says davar shein miskaven, but Tana Katana like Rabbi Shimon, and our Mishnah, let's say, is following Rabbi Shimon, who says davar shein miskaven mutter. So the Gemara says no, mishum the Rav savar like Rabbi Yehuda. I'm sorry, mishum the Rav savar like Rabbi Yehuda called the Tani Rabbi Shimon melat lately. So are you telling me that Rav paskins like one rabbi in the Mishnah, and he curses out anybody else who follows an authentic, credible viewpoint that's in the Mishnah, the viewpoint of Rabbi Shimon? Does he curse everybody that paskins like Rabbi Shimon? By the way, who's Rabbi Shimon here? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So basically, again, you have a machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if you're not miskaven, if that is the results, you can't do it. And Rabbi Shimon says, we look at your kavana. And so you think Rav paskins like one Tana, he curses everybody who paskins differently? So the Gemara concludes, no. Rav will tell you, you know why I'm opposed to allowing the door to be opened and necessarily and definitely putting out the fire? Everybody knows, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, although he usually says all that matters is kavana, not the end result, that's only if it's just a possibility. But when it's a psik reisha, when the effect is absolute, when the effect is definite, then even Rabbi Shimon is not going to allow you to do the malacha. So what's going on over here? Excuse me. We have a malacha. We have a fire, a candle. We have an act of opening the door. The act of opening the door is in order to get into the door.
Fire Rescue Station 60 on East Hallandale Beach Boulevard in Hallandale Beach.
My phone heard us talking about fire.
It's probably calling the fire station. Be careful.
It started to give me information for the fire department. Okay, back to Gemara. Rabbi Shimon usually says that we only look at your intention, but that's only when it's not 100% certain to occur. Psik reisha v'layamos, but a case that is obvious that what's going to happen is the malacha, just like if you cut off the head of an animal, even though you only want to take the head, you don't want to kill the animal, but cutting the head of the animal kills the animal, it is going to occur. So similarly here, opening the door equals putting out the candle. Rabbi Shimon won't allow that. And so the reason why Rav said it's chas v'shalom, heaven forbid, to allow somebody to open a door in such a way which is going to put out the fire, is because Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon would all agree that such is not permitted, even though your desire is not to put out the fire, but it's a psik reisha v'layamos. The fire is absolutely necessarily going to go out, and therefore you're not allowed to do it. This is the explanation of Rav. And that's why he was so emphatically opposed to this practice. That ends that little micro discussion. We're going to talk more about doors and candles in a moment. Any comments or questions before we continue? All righty, let's go. I'm Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda further taught. Poiseach Adam Deles. A person is allowed to open a door. Kineged Midura B'Shabbos. Yehuda said a person may open the door opposite a Midura. A Midura is a fire, but unlike here, we're talking about a single lamp or candle.
It would be considered a controlled fire.
Right. Well, a Midura, in modern Hebrew, Midura means a bonfire, which is a large fire. Here, I don't think we mean a bonfire in that sense. We're talking about a fire, let's say in a fireplace. That's more of a substantive fire. Although, what happens when you open the door? The fire is how do you call it? Increased. One candle, you blow at it and it goes out. But a larger fire, oxygen or wind could actually cause the fire to flare up. Right? Umavir ha'ar. I believe that's what he's saying. So Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to open the door, even though maybe the fire will become a little more enlarged. Layit Allah Abaye, and Abaye said, this is not an acceptable Jewish practice. He cursed anybody who would follow this practice. He emphatically spoke out against it. So Gemara wants to understand what's going on. The Mayaskin. What are we talking about? If we're talking about a standard average wind, my taima, demand also, what's wrong? Rashi, aim derech lahaber beruach mitzuya, leipsik reisha v'layamos. Regular breeze, a regular wind, a little draft from a door being open is insufficient to really fan the flames of a fire in the fireplace. If we're talking about a super strong wind, in Florida, we talk about winds, right? Up to 30 miles an hour, that's just normal. 30 is already considered, gust is already considered something that they're going to send out a reporter to help get everybody scared. And 75 miles an hour is a tropical storm, or am I mixing it up? Anyways, so, and by the way, in halacha as well, the Florida rule is that the Eruv is considered to be in place on Shabbos until you hit 40-mile-per-hour winds. The Rabbanim in Miami say when you hit 40 miles an hour winds, then we're going to assume this is a gale force storm, and the presumption is the Eruv has probably been broken.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
could we extrapolate the rules from a fire to a hurricane, what you're allowed to do on Shabbos to save stuff?
Let's put that on hold. We'll talk about other events, and it's not exactly identical, and it works two ways. Some of the concerns that Chazal had about a fire are not applicable to a storm, and therefore there may be greater leniencies. And then conversely, so it's not exactly identical, though there are parallels in the halacha. But we'll get to that.
Rabbi, regarding the 40 miles an hour winds with the Eruv, how, if I don't, on Shabbos, if I don't have access to meteorological reports, how do I know if winds reach 40 miles or above? I mean, am I just going to?
That's a good question.
It looks a little windy, too windy, so therefore the Eruv is considered down.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe if you start seeing multiple palm branches falling off trees, and one piece of furniture falls off the deck of the you could assume that it's a ruach. You could assume that it's a 40-mile-per-hour, which is classified as a ruach she'einoi mitzuya, a beyond the typical kind of gusts, sustained gusts of wind, as our meteorologists like to talk about. But it's a good question. We don't necessarily know, but the average regular weather storm doesn't get to there. So, for example, last Shabbos was a very bad weather. There was a lot of rain. There was some wind, but that was not, I don't believe, a kind of wind that disqualified the Eruv. Once we start having, once we start talking about possible evacuations or whatever, or they say it's no longer safe to evacuate, assume the Eruv is down. But you know what? It's a good question, and I want to find out, because when we give guidance, we tell people 40 miles an hour. How should they know? So that's a good question. Let's put that on the short list of things that need to be resolved, and we're not going to find the answer in the Gemara. So again, back to our story. We're talking now about a medura, a fire in the hearth, a fire in the fireplace. Abaya says, not a good idea to open the door. And the Gemara wants to know what's wrong. Are we talking about regular wind, a regular breeze? Well, then that's not going to do anything to the fire. The fire is not impressed by a regular little breeze. Now, maybe we're talking about an incredibly strong wind, over 40 miles an hour. Again, the Gemara doesn't use that. It's not scientific. I'm just saying something that's really considerable. My time of demand is shari, then why would anyone allow exposing a fire to that degree of wind, which would certainly cause the fire to be inflamed? So the Gemara answers no. In truth, we're talking here about regular wind. And Rabbi Yehuda actually had a very good point. We're not afraid that a regular wind is going to mess with your fire, and therefore, who cares if you open the door? Mar Savar Abaya felt Gazrinan. We should make a gzeira. Umar Savar loy Gazrinan. And Rabbi Yehuda says no gzeira. What's the gzeira? Anyone want to try to explain what the gzeira is? The gzeira is that people don't always know on Shabbos if it went from 20 miles an hour to 40 to 50 miles an hour. And because we don't all have weather, we don't all have the meters that gauge the speed of the wind. So Abaya says, listen, people don't know. Let's just not go there.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Are we back here to the point that the intention alone is a problem? Because I was thinking of the door. If the normal opening of the door several times would put out the fire, there's nothing wrong with opening a door in a regular way.
Right.
But if you're in a condo and you open the door, you get this draft and it could make the flame even larger than it is.
No, I'm just wondering if the intention alone is putting you into trouble.
I'm sorry.
We have it the other way, but we don't have it this way too often.
What do you mean?
That the activity itself is permitted.
There's nothing wrong with opening the door. You just should be mindful not to have it in
No,
a
but
way.
if you know you open the door 3 or 4 times, it will put out that little flame.
Now we're talking. So first of all, we should not have our Shabbos candles or other lamps directly in the path of the wind. That's first of all. But here we're talking about a fireplace. We're talking about a larger fire. Which I don't know, is it usually right when you open up the door? You know, I'm a Florida boy. I don't really have a lot of experience with fireplaces, and but it's probably best practice to have it off to the side so that the wind doesn't blow into it. Let's take a look at Tosfos, who gives us a practical guide.
I'll tell you, there's a practical issue, because on Shabbos, when you light the Shabbos candles and then you open, it's a question where to place them. Because if you place them right behind the door and you keep
so let's look at Tosfos, and then I want you to revisit your comments, because I think this will support what you were going to say. Hilkach, therefore, Sarach li zohar. This is Tosfos. Be careful. You should not open the door if it's going to lead into the Madura. Even an average wind. Abaya follows Rabbi Yehuda, and he is a later authority, and he builds upon that which was before him. And when is this a realistic concern? When you actually have your fireplace in proximity to the door in a way that it could possibly be affected by the fire. So basically, you want to know all the halachic considerations a Jew should have when building a home? Well, maybe here we have another. Try to keep your fireplace out of the direct path of the wind, lest you have a concern on Shabbos. Now, I'm sorry, doctor, I cut you off. So if you'll please revisit your comments. You said that it has a practical halachic application regarding the placement of Shabbos candles, you said?
Shabbos candles, Hanukkah candles.
Absolutely. On Shabbos? Absolutely. That's what Tosfos is making, I believe, your point. So, Yashikayach for that. An interesting Gemara, because look, being honest, I think our instincts would read more like Rav Yehuda. But Abaya is being practical. He's being practical about the limitations of the human ability to gauge, etc. Let's look at the Shulchan Aruch really fast, and then we'll continue. Asr liftayach hadeles. Keneged hamadura she kroiva ktsas eladeles. If your Madura is pretty close to the door, or I should say a little close to the door, you cannot open the door. Using the exact words of Tosfos. Even though the wind outside is very average, still you shouldn't. But if the door is already open, you're allowed to close the door. The act of closing the door would not be perceived as the act of cutting down or turning off the fire. You're turning off a certain, because the wind helps fuel and fan the flames. Closing the door might cause them to be diminished. Now we need to take a look at the Mishnah Berurah for a moment. And so if you'll please indulge me here, because the Mishnah Berurah asked the question we're all wondering. Here, so the Mishnah Berurah is commenting on the language of our halacha here. Asur liftayach. So he says again, you can't open the door. Afilu ein sham el ruach mitzui. Mishnah Berurah says afilu etc. Ritzayin elaymar after yidei ruach mitzui ein darach hamadura lahaver yoser. Even though usually wind will not cause the fire to be enlarged, afilu hachi asur de gazrin and ato sheina mitzuya. It is yet permitted, prohibited. Now pull out your highlights. But if there's no breeze, mutter, you're allowed to open the door. So we're not saying you can never open the door, but on a windy, but not terribly windy day, you shouldn't. Or better yet, don't station your fire in proximity to the door. Now he says something interesting. If when you knock on the door, you bang on the door, that creates wind. I don't think our doors are likely to do that. Although actually, if you have a very thin or light door, I'm thinking back to, you have like these like patio screen light doors.
I don't think he means knocking on the door. I think he means closing the door strongly.
Maybe. So you're saying defikas adelos means the slamming of the door, not the
slamming of the door, exactly.
Okay, so you're probably right. Interesting. Why are you allowed to close the door even if you're going to cause the wind to stop fanning the flames and the fire might go out? You're not doing something. You're just cutting off the spigot. You're not actually affecting the fire, and therefore, again, I think it's based on the writings of the Magen Avraham, who says, "Hey, you want to load for us?" Afilu l'ha'isrim. Okay, actually, no, he says something different. All right, let's continue in the Gemara.
Rabbi.
Yes.
There's the fire is spreading, and there's also the question of responsibility to your neighbor. You have a fire, and you say, I'm very careful. I don't want to put it out, but there's a danger that it'll spread to your neighbor. You have a responsibility to a neighbor, right?
I hear you. That's definitely an important point to consider. So, for example, I think what you're trying to say is in a condo type environment, you may be able to get all of your people out of the house, but your neighbors might not. And in a fire, the elevator is suspended and you have people that are not able. And so that is a strong case, probably not probably. We could certainly say that in such an environment, one should expeditiously put out the fire because it is literally a question of pikuach nefesh. So yeah. Professor, you're muted. We want to hear your... Professor, you're talking to us? Oh.
Maybe the responsibility to your neighbors is expressed by notifying them about the fire, and the neighbors are not limited to saving their belongings before the fire in their houses start.
Right. Well, I think Ribeiro is talking about a situation of life-threatening circumstances, which are even more complicated. Anyways, I think so. The Gemara is now going to proceed to go to our big question. The question of the border, the blockading the fire with vessels. Now, interestingly enough, it appears the common understanding of this blockade, this barrier, is not that it's going to prevent the fire from spreading, but that it might temporarily slow down the spread with ample time to allow the firefighters to do their job professionally. This is the language that is inferred, I don't remember where, everywhere. So the Mishnah says, Oisa mechitza, and Rabbi Yossi says, don't bring earthenware that's going to explode. Doctor, here we go. Dr. Stalmer, this is where we use the words garam, kiboy, and lememra. Are we trying to say that Abanon Savri garam kiboy motor? The rabbis say garam kiboy, an act that will indirectly lead to the fire being extinguished, is permitted. The Rabbi Yossi savar garam kiboy aser, and Rabbi Yossi says even indirect extinguishing is prohibited. Therefore, the rabbis would say, put the water balloon or put the vessel put the vessel there so that it'll explode and create a fire extinguishing effect. Rabbi Yossi says no. That sounds nice. That sounds like it's the right paradigm to understand and to explain the difference between Rabbi Yossi and his contemporaries, the Chachamim. But ultimately, we have the opposite indication in another brisa. What's that brisa? Tanya. Oisa and mechitza b'kelim reikanim. One is permitted to make a mechitza, a barrier, if the vessels are empty. Uvimelayim, and if they are full of stuff, she'ein darkon lishtaber, so long as they're not likely to break. The elu malayin she'ein darkon lishtaber. You want to know what's considered a vessel that's not going to break? Clay mataches. Metal vessels, they don't usually implode in fire. They are fairly durable. Rabbi Yossi adds, af klei kfar shichin or klei kfar chananya in darkon lishtaber. Rabbi Yossi adds, you know what? There are other kinds of vessels that are also pretty durable. Those are the vessels that are manufactured in kfar shichin and kfar chananya. Why are they not prone to break? Rashi, cheres ha'asim ha'oisei afar. The vessels that are made, the earthenware that's made from the clay of that region, chazaku is strong, vein mishtaber. Alma, the Rabbi Yossi gram kiboy tfei mekel midrabanan. From here we see somehow, I'm not sure how, that Rabbi Yossi is a little more lenient. He's a little more permissive in the case of gram kiboy, because he expands what one is allowed to place in the line of fire to vessels that are usually durable but potentially could break. He's a little more lenient. It's not that he says you're allowed to do gram kiboy, but he's at least more lenient than his contemporaries. And so this doesn't sound consistent with our our attempt to understand the Mishnah to be talking about gram kiboy or not. Maybe you'll be inclined to say, okay, let's swap the opinions of our Mishnah. The Chachamim will be the ones to say that you can't do kli cheres chadashim, you can't use new earthenware. And Rabbi Yossi would say you could. Or Rabbi Yossi the Braisa l'divrei kamar. I'm sorry, maybe you'll say no. You'll turn around the viewpoint of the Mishnah. So Rabbi Yossi is permissive and the Chachamim are prohibitive. Rabbi Yossi the Braisa l'divrei kamar, and Rabbi Yossi in the Braisa we just read, who says that there are other kinds of vessels that can be exposed to fire. He's not saying his own opinion because he's permissive. He's saying, even you guys who are afraid of gram kiboy, you're afraid of triggering a fire extinguishing process, and therefore says you cannot put vessels that cannot withstand the heat. According to you guys, you should still allow certain very strong earthenware vessels. This is a way to propose, a way to resolve the issue, but that's not going to work. Mimatzis avchala, we cannot really flip the authors, the authorities of the Mishnah. Why? Because we have evidence in the name of Rav that Rabbi Yossi is known to be the guy who prohibits leading to fire extinguishing. So let me just recap. And again, here, this is, as I told you, a Gemara that's more reminiscent of the typical analytical process of the Gemara in attempting to resolve two seemingly contradictory texts. We have a discussion in the Mishnah about the permissibility of placing breakable vessels full of water in the path of the fire. And we want to understand how that jives with the Braisa, where Rabbi Yossi seems to take a more lenient position. The easiest thing would be to just say that one of the texts, they mixed up the names of the authors, and the Gemara tries to explain how you would do that. And the Gemara ultimately says, no, we cannot say that because Rabbi Yossi is documented as being the proponent of prohibiting gram kiboy. So we're back to a problem where your Rabbi Yossi sounds inconsistent in the Brisa to the way his stated position is in the Mishnah. But what we do know is that Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that you're not allowed to even indirectly trigger a fire being extinguished. Interesting. Tosfos asked a good question. Oh, we'll put that Tosfos on the side for a second. We'll get there. Rather, what are we going to do? How do we resolve a slightly uncomfortable Mishnah and Brisa, where Rabbi Yossi in one is more strict and restrictive about exposing vessels to fire, and the Brisa, which indicates that Rabbi Yossi is more permissive. So don't change Rabbi Yossi's position. Brisa kula Rabbi Yossi, and the Brisa which was bothering us is actually all the position of Rabbi Yossi, which again Rabbi Yossi says that you're not allowed to cause a kibbutz. So what was the missing language of the Brisa? Let's read. The Chasuri Mechzer of Hachitani, the Brisa was missing some words. We need to fill in some. We need to read between the lines and reread the Brisa. Here is how it reads. Oisim mechitza b'kelim reikanim. One should make a mechitza, a border with empty vessels. Uvim leim, and even if there's stuff inside of them, we're not concerned. If she'ein darkam lishtaber, they don't break. Elohim kelim she'ein darkam lishtaber. The following are the vessels that we trust not to break under the heat of fire: klei matachais, metal vessels, klei kfar shichin and klei kfar chananya, and vessels made out of the clay of the village of Shichin and the village of Chananya. She Rabbi Yossi Omer, and indeed, Rabbi Yossi teaches af klei kfar Shichin uklei kfar Chananya ein darkam lishtaber. So we've turned the whole Brisa into a Rabbi Yossi fest. Rabbi Yossi is not being lenient. He's just clarifying some intimate knowledge about the durability of certain vessels made out of a certain very strong, durable, fire retardant material from Kfar Shichin and Kfar Chananya. Rabbi Yossi is not lenient at all. Just he identifies vessels that are permissible under his guidelines. So again, we had a Mishnah and a Brisa that seemed to be a little bit awkward. They didn't exactly jive. There was an initial attempt to flip the authors or the authorship of the two statements in the Mishnah. The Gemara rejects that and then says that with a simple rereading of the Brisa, but with the realization that it's all Rabbi Yossi, we can see how Rabbi Yossi is not being lenient. He's just explaining the extent of his viewpoint about vessels that can be exposed to fire. The Tosfos that I started saying and didn't say is as follows. Tosfos says, it would have been so much easier for the Gemara to propose swapping the opinions in the Brisa to the point where Rabbi Yossi would be the more machmir, Rabbanan would be the more mekel. A Brisa generally, the Brisa generally has a little less providence. It's a little bit more malleable than a Mishnah, which is strongly edited and preserved. So why does not the Gemara attempt to swap the Brisa? And Tosfos says, in truth, being that the Gemara is going to reject any attempt to amend either text, the Gemara went to the more extreme case, knocked it all out, and then presented us a new case. So it's more, if I understand Tosfos correctly, this was more of it was just a tool to help us see the end result, which is that we need to reread the Brisa in a Chasuri Mechzera B'Hachi Ktani manner. I think we're going to stop over here. Now that we know that Rabbi Yossi, I'm just going to tell you where we lead off. Now that we know that Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that we can never be geram kiba, we can never indirectly cause the fire to go out, and therefore you cannot put a water balloon or any other vessel that's going to pop under the exposure to heat. The Rabbanan are the ones that say you can. Well, we now need to synthesize these opinions with a seemingly unrelated but conceptually related discussion, which is, and we're going to discuss this tomorrow, and it's an interesting topic that I think maybe you've even thought about. What happens if a person has Hashem's name written on their body. What's the problem? There's a few problems. First of all, Hashem's name needs to be treated with honor, and it cannot be exposed to certain environments. It also is not allowed to be erased ever. You're not to erase Hashem's name. Well, that's quite awkward if it's on your person, because even under a worst case scenario, hopefully a person takes a few showers or baths in a year. And if they have Hashem's name written in ink, that could jeopardize or cause the erasure of Hashem's name. And so the question is, are you allowed to directly or indirectly lead to the erasure of Hashem's name? And that's going to be somewhat of a parallel to our discussion of indirectly putting out fire. So you could indirectly put out fire. You could indirectly erase Hashem's name. And so tomorrow's Gemara will attempt to synthesize and make sense out of the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, in our case, of not being allowed to indirectly put out fire, and possibly a scenario where he permits indirectly leading to Hashem's name being erased. And if you've ever wondered, because I've shared with you that I once, when I was in Burbank, California, doing shlichut as a yeshiva student in the summer, we met somebody, or at least I've seen more than one person, but we met a person who had the words Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad tattooed across his chest. As a relatively sheltered yeshiva student, that was kind of a little traumatizing to see, but that's not important. What's important is, if this guy wants to become a Baal Teshuvah, can he take a shower and expose Hashem's name to his own unclothed body? What about going to a mikvah or going into a bathroom? Are there any restrictions? And so that'll be tomorrow's discussion. My dear friends, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for another journey through the Talmud. I hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking. And again, thank you all for making this the best Talmud Chabura in town. Looking forward to seeing everybody tomorrow with Hashem's help. Shkoyach. Stand by for Chumash.